I brought black roses and first-class tickets to Paris to my husband's office to surprise him for Valentine's Day. Instead, I walked into a lobby full of cheering employees, just in time to see him slip a 5-carat diamond ring onto his CEO's finger. He called her his true queen. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply turned around, walked to my car, and made one phone call to withdraw my $647 million investment from their company. By the time I reached my driveway 15 minutes later, I had 138 missed calls, and my own family was pounding on my front door. Before I tell you how I dismantled his entire life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach someone that loyalty is a highly expensive asset. The afternoon sun was reflecting sharply off the towering glass facade of the Apex Tech building in downtown Atlanta. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, adjusting my grip on the massive bouquet of imported black roses. They were rare, expensive, and exactly the kind of dramatic gesture my husband Desmond always claimed to appreciate. In my designer handbag, I carried a sleek silver envelope containing 2 first-class tickets to Paris. It was Valentine's Day, and I had planned this surprise for months. I wanted to celebrate not just our marriage but the upcoming initial public offering of his company. Desmond was the chief operating officer of Apex Tech, and for the last 2 years he had practically lived at the office. He constantly told me how hard he was working to secure our future, to elevate our status in the exclusive social circles my mother cared so deeply about. I was just the quiet administrative worker to the rest of the world, a plain and boring wife who did not quite fit into the glamorous life he was building. Or so he thought. I walked through the revolving doors and immediately noticed the atmosphere in the grand lobby was entirely different from a typical Tuesday afternoon. The massive open space with its white marble floors and modern lighting was packed with people. Employees were gathered in a wide circle holding champagne flutes and murmuring with palpable excitement. Soft music played through the overhead speakers. I assumed it was an impromptu celebration for the upcoming initial public offering. I smiled to myself, thinking my timing was absolutely perfect. I made my way quietly through the edge of the crowd, careful not to crush the black roses against anyone. As I moved closer to the center of the gathering, the crowd parted slightly, and I finally saw him. Desmond was standing near the indoor waterfall feature, looking incredibly handsome in his custom-tailored charcoal suit. But he was not looking at financial reports or addressing the staff about software developments. He was holding the hands of Victoria, the chief executive officer of Apex Tech. Victoria was a woman who made sure everyone knew she had attended the right schools, belonged to the right elite sorority, and wore the right designer labels. She was everything my family constantly reminded me I was not. Showy, ambitious, and desperate for the spotlight. I stopped dead in my tracks, hiding behind a tall potted palm plant. My heart gave a strange, heavy thud against my ribs as Desmond suddenly dropped down onto one knee, right there on the marble floor. The entire lobby erupted into cheers and whistles. I stood completely frozen, gripping the stems of the black roses so tightly the thorns bit through the protective wrapping and into my palms. I did not feel the pain. All my senses were entirely focused on the scene playing out a few yards away from me. Desmond reached into his suit jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He flipped it open, revealing a diamond ring so massive it caught the light from the chandeliers above. The crowd gasped in awe. Desmond looked up at Victoria with an expression of pure adoration, an expression I had not seen directed at me in years. He cleared his throat, and his voice carried across the silent lobby. "Victoria, you are the most brilliant and beautiful woman I have ever known. We have built this company together, and tomorrow we take it public. But today I want to secure something much more important. You are my true queen, the only woman who belongs by my side at the top. Will you marry me?" Victoria covered her mouth with perfectly manicured hands, feigning shock before letting out a joyous scream. "I will!" she shouted, nodding frantically. "I absolutely will." Desmond slid the 5-carat diamond onto her finger, stood up, and pulled her into a passionate kiss. The employees broke into thunderous applause, raising their champagne glasses to toast the happy couple. I stood there in the shadows watching my husband of 6 years promise his life to another woman, while his entire staff celebrated the betrayal. The air in my lungs felt thick and heavy. A lesser woman might have screamed. A weaker woman might have dropped the flowers, marched into the center of the room, and caused a scene that would be gossiped about in our social circles for decades. But I am not a lesser woman. I am a woman who understands the absolute power of silence and strategy. I did not shed a single tear. My face remained an unreadable mask. I simply turned around and walked back toward the revolving doors. On my way out, I passed a large stainless steel trash receptacle. Without breaking my stride, I dropped the expensive bouquet of black roses and the silver envelope containing the Paris tickets directly into the garbage. I walked out of the building and stepped back into the bright afternoon sunlight. I retrieved my car from the hidden VIP parking garage across the street. While the world thought I drove a practical, sensible sedan, I slid into the driver's seat of my custom Porsche Cayenne. The heavy door closed, shutting out the noise of the city. The leather interior smelled rich and familiar. I sat behind the steering wheel for a long moment, letting the reality of what I had just witnessed wash over me. Desmond had not just cheated on me, he had publicly humiliated me. He had decided that his figurehead chief executive officer was a better match for his ego than the quiet wife waiting at home. I pulled my phone from my handbag. I had 3 phone calls to make, and each one needed to be executed with absolute precision. The first call was to the concierge travel service. My voice was completely steady as I instructed the agent to cancel the flights to Paris and the reservations at the luxury hotel. The agent asked if I wanted to reschedule. I told her the trip was permanently canceled and ended the call. The second task required the banking application on my phone. I logged into the joint checking and savings accounts I shared with Desmond. I needed to see exactly how he had managed to purchase a diamond ring of that magnitude. It only took a few seconds to find the answer. The savings account which had held our emergency funds and the money we were supposedly saving for a larger house showed a balance of exactly 0. Yesterday afternoon, Desmond had initiated a wire transfer of $150,000. He had completely drained our joint life savings to buy an engagement ring for his mistress. A cold, calculated calm settled over my entire body. He thought he was incredibly smart. He thought he had secured his future with the glamorous executive while stripping his boring wife of her financial security. It was time to show him exactly who he had been married to. I locked the joint accounts, reporting the cards as stolen to ensure he could not make another single transaction. Then I prepared for the third and most important phone call of my life. I dialed the direct private line of Jonathan, my wealth management attorney on Wall Street. Jonathan was one of the few people on earth who knew my actual identity. To my family and my husband, I was just a low-level administrative worker who liked to read financial blogs. But in reality, I was the sole founder and owner of Obsidian Ventures, a highly secretive venture capital firm that operated through multiple layers of corporate shielding. Jonathan answered on the first ring. "Good afternoon, Quinn. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Jonathan," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion, "I need you to trigger the emergency divestment clause on the Apex Tech portfolio." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Quinn, you cannot be serious. The initial public offering is scheduled for tomorrow morning. The valuation is peaking. If we pull out now, the entire structure collapses." "That is exactly the point, Jonathan," I replied smoothly. "Pull the funds, all of them." "Quinn, we are talking about $647 million in backing capital. The market will panic. The company will be insolvent before the banks close today. Are you absolutely certain you want to initiate a total withdrawal?" I pictured Desmond slipping that ring onto Victoria's finger. I pictured him smiling at the crowd, believing he was the king of the world. "Yes, Jonathan, I am entirely certain. Withdraw the $647 million from Apex Tech immediately. Liquidate the backing and sever all financial ties. I want them bleeding out by the time they finish their champagne." Understood, Jonathan said, his professional tone masking his obvious shock. The transfer will be initiated immediately. The funds will be secured in the offshore holding accounts within 15 minutes. They will be notified by their banking institution shortly after. Thank you, Jonathan, I said, and ended the call. I started the engine of the Porsche and pulled out of the parking garage, merging into the busy Atlanta traffic. The drive to my suburban home took exactly 45 minutes. During that drive, I thought about the house of cards Desmond and Victoria had built. Apex Tech was a promising software company, but it had been burning through cash at an alarming rate to artificially inflate its value before the public offering. Victoria was a terrible chief executive officer who cared more about magazine covers than product development. Desmond was an arrogant operator who thought charm could replace actual revenue. The only reason the company had survived long enough to reach an initial public offering was because my firm Obsidian Ventures had been quietly propping them up with massive capital injections. Desmond had no idea that the mysterious venture capital group, keeping his company afloat, was entirely controlled by the wife he completely ignored. He had no idea that I owned 89% of the company he was currently celebrating, and now I had just pulled the plug. 10 minutes into my drive, my phone screen lit up. It was a call from Desmond. I let it ring. 2 minutes later, he called again. Then again. Then the text messages started pouring in. The first few were standard. Hey, where are you? Call me. Then the tone abruptly shifted as the financial earthquake began to register at the office. Quinn, answer the phone. Something is wrong with the bank. The company accounts are frozen. Did you do something to the joint cards? My card was just declined in front of the board members. I kept my eyes on the road, listening to the relentless buzzing of my phone vibrating against the passenger seat. The notifications were coming in a continuous stream. By the time I turned into my upscale neighborhood, the situation at his office had clearly escalated from embarrassment to absolute panic. Quinn, please pick up. The venture capital firm just pulled out. Obsidian withdrew everything. The bank is calling our loans. The initial public offering is dead. Please tell me you are at home. I need to talk to you. I turned into my driveway and pressed the button to open the wrought iron gates. I pulled the Porsche into the garage and turned off the engine. I picked up my phone and looked at the screen. I had 138 missed calls from Desmond. The sheer volume of his desperation was almost amusing. He was watching his entire corporate empire evaporate into thin air, and he was looking to his plain administrative wife for comfort, not knowing I was the one who had dropped the bomb. I stepped out of the car and walked into the quiet house. The silence of the empty rooms was a stark contrast to the chaos I had just unleashed on his life. I placed my handbag on the kitchen counter and poured myself a glass of cold water. I was just beginning to mentally draft the emails I would need to send to my legal team when the front doorbell rang. It was not a normal ring. It was a frantic, aggressive pounding accompanied by the continuous buzzing of the doorbell chime. Someone was leaning heavily on the button. I walked into the hallway and glanced at the security camera monitor mounted on the wall. The high-definition screen showed the front porch. Desmond was standing there, his tie loosened, his perfectly tailored suit looking disheveled. He was pacing back and forth, running his hands over his face in sheer panic, but he was not alone. Standing right behind him, arms crossed tightly over her chest, was my mother, Corinne. She wore her signature designer pearls and a look of absolute fury that could curdle milk. Next to her stood my older sister, Giselle, holding her expensive leather handbag like a weapon. Giselle had always been the golden child, the former pageant queen who constantly looked for opportunities to remind me of my shortcomings. My mother pounded her fist against the heavy wooden door. "Quinn, open this door right now. We know you are in there. Open the door before you ruin this family completely." I stood in the quiet hallway, sipping my water and watching them on the screen. The betrayal of a husband was one thing. I had handled that with a single phone call. But the betrayal of a family required a much more personal approach. They had come to protect the golden son-in-law and to force the scapegoat daughter into submission. They had absolutely no idea that they were standing on the porch of a woman who now held all the cards, all the money, and all the power. I took a deep breath, set my glass down, and reached for the door handle. It was time to welcome them to the nightmare they had brought upon themselves. I pulled open the heavy oak door before they could strike the wood again. Desmond stumbled across the threshold, his face flushed a mottled angry red that clashed horribly with his expensive charcoal suit. He did not look like an executive who had just proposed to his true queen. He looked like a man who had just been publicly stripped of his armor. "Are you completely out of your mind?" he screamed, pushing past me into the foyer. He did not even bother to check if neighbors were listening. My black card was declined, Quinn. Declined. I was standing at the mahogany bar at the St. Regis, ordering celebratory vintage champagne for the entire executive board, and the bartender handed my card back to me like I was some deadbeat off the street. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? The chief financial officer had to pull out his personal card to cover a $3,000 tab because my own wife decided to throw a petty tantrum. I closed the door, leaning my back against the solid wood and folded my arms. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I imagine that was almost as humiliating as proposing to your boss in the middle of the company lobby while your wife watched from behind a potted plant. Desmond froze. The color drained from his face for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting back and forth as his brain processed that I had actually been there. But men like Desmond do not feel shame. They only feel anger when their carefully constructed realities are threatened. The shock vanished instantly, replaced by a defensive rage that seemed to radiate from his pores. "You were there," he let out a harsh, bitter laugh, throwing his hands in the air. "Of course you were, always creeping around in the background like a shadow, always showing up uninvited where you do not belong. But that does not give you the right to mess with my finances. You froze the joint accounts. You locked the credit lines. You committed financial sabotage on the eve of the biggest day of my professional life." Before I could respond, my mother pushed her way past Desmond, her heels clicking sharply against the imported Italian tile. Corinne was a woman who treated life like an endless audition for a country club membership. She marched into my foyer, smelling of expensive floral perfume and aggressive entitlement. Her silk blouse was perfectly pressed, and her signature pearls rested heavily against her collarbone. "What is wrong with you, Quinn?" she demanded, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. Desmond is an outstanding Morehouse man. He is a chief operating officer doing big things in the corporate world. You do not humiliate a man of his stature over a silly misunderstanding. You do not sabotage a black man who is breaking glass ceilings just because you are feeling insecure. "A misunderstanding?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. "Mother." I watched him put a 5-carat diamond ring on another woman's finger. He got down on one knee. He asked her to marry him. Corinne waved her manicured hand in the air as if swatting away a pesky fly. "Oh, please. Desmond already explained everything on the drive over here. It is a strategic move, a public relations stunt to boost the stock price before the initial public offering tomorrow. You would understand these complex business dynamics if you were not just a lowly administrative worker pushing papers all day. You have absolutely no vision for the bigger picture. This is why you never pledged a sorority. This is why you never thrived in Jack and Jill. You lack the fundamental understanding of how elite society operates." I stared at my mother, genuinely marveling at the sheer depth of her delusion. She was so desperate to maintain her proximity to Desmond's perceived power that she was actively endorsing my emotional execution. She would rather see her daughter humiliated than admit her perfect son-in-law was a fraud. She did not know that my venture capital firm had repeatedly flagged Desmond's department for gross incompetence. I had spent 2 years secretly blocking the board from firing him, protecting the very career she was now using to insult me. "A public relations stunt," I repeated, keeping my tone completely flat. "So the $150,000 he wired out of our life savings yesterday to buy that engagement ring was just a marketing expense." Desmond scoffed, stepping forward aggressively and invading my personal space. "It is an investment in our future, Quinn. Victoria is the face of the company. The market loves a power couple at the helm of a tech startup. Once the company goes public tomorrow morning, that $150,000 will turn into millions. I was going to put the money back before you even noticed it was gone. But you had to be a hysterical, jealous wife and freeze everything. You always ruin everything. You cannot stand to see me succeed because you have no ambition of your own. That is when Giselle decided to make her grand entrance. My older sister glided into the foyer looking like she had just stepped off a high-fashion runway. As a former pageant queen at Howard University, Giselle had built her entire identity on being the most beautiful, the most successful, and the most desirable daughter. She looked me up and down, her lips curling into a sneer of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Look at you, Quinn," she sighed dramatically, resting a perfectly manicured hand on Desmond's tense shoulder. "You are wearing a baggy sweater and basic leggings at 4 in the afternoon. You do not even try to maintain yourself. Is it any wonder Desmond has to look elsewhere to find a woman who knows how to represent him properly? Victoria carries herself like an elite wife. She knows how to dress, how to network with investors, how to host charity galas. What do? You hide in this house that Desmond works so hard to pay for, and you eat takeout." Giselle walked a slow, predatory circle around me, clicking her tongue in mock pity. "You have let yourself go completely. You carry no status. You bring absolutely no value to his personal brand. I spend 2 hours in the Pilates studio every morning to ensure my husband has a wife he can be proud to show off. I endure Harrison's long business trips and late nights at the office because I understand the sacrifices required to build an empire. You do nothing but drag Desmond down. He is about to be a millionaire tomorrow, and you are embarrassing him by throwing a childish tantrum over a temporary business arrangement. You should be down on your knees feeling grateful he even bothers to come home to a woman as painfully mediocre as you." My mother nodded in vigorous agreement, crossing her arms. "Giselle is absolutely right. We have a reputation to uphold in this community. Do you have any idea how hard I have worked to secure our family's standing in Oak Bluffs? We summer with state senators and corporate chief executives. We are part of the elite. And here you are acting like some uncultured woman from the projects, shutting off your husband's credit cards because you cannot handle his strategic business partnerships. Turn the accounts back on Quinn, right now. You will not ruin this initial public offering, and you will not ruin this family name." The absolute absurdity of the situation washed over me like a freezing ocean wave. Here was my mother and my sister standing in the home I quietly paid for, defending the man who was actively and publicly discarding me. They had bought completely into Desmond's lies because his lies were wrapped in the glossy language of wealth and status they so desperately craved. They called him a visionary. They called me an embarrassment. If only they knew that the very house we were standing in, with its vaulted ceilings and custom marble floors, was purchased entirely in cash by my anonymous holding company. If only they knew that Desmond's mid-six-figure salary was a mere drop in the bucket compared to the quarterly dividends I earned from my private investments. If only they knew that the glorious initial public offering they were currently worshipping was already disintegrating into dust because I had just pulled the financial floor out from under it. I looked at Desmond. His jaw was firmly set, his chest puffed out like a proud rooster. He was surrounded by the women of my family who were treating him like a victimized king. He actually believed he had won. "I will not be unfreezing the accounts, Desmond," I said softly, holding his gaze. "And as for your brilliant corporate future with Victoria, I highly suggest you go back to the office immediately. I have a feeling your public relations stunt is about to get very complicated." Desmond took a threatening step forward, his fists clenching tightly at his sides. His charming facade was completely gone, replaced by a venomous rage. "You listen to me, you pathetic little—" He did not get to finish his sentence. The heavy, authoritative thud of a luxury car door closing echoed loudly from the driveway. Through the open front door, I watched as Harrison stepped out of his sleek black Mercedes-Benz. Harrison was Giselle's husband, a white wealth management fund director whom my mother treated like a literal deity. To Corinne, Harrison was the ultimate prize. He was the white knight who had elevated our family into exclusive circles even her elite social clubs could not easily access. He walked up my driveway with the arrogant swagger of a man who firmly believed the world owed him unquestioning obedience. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and stepped into my foyer, looking around the space with utter disdain. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. Giselle immediately rushed to his side, clinging to his arm like a damsel in distress. "Quinn is being completely unreasonable, darling. She locked Desmond out of his own money right before his big day tomorrow. She is trying to ruin the public offering because she is jealous and bitter." Harrison let out a heavy, dramatic sigh and looked at me as if I were a stubborn toddler holding up an important board meeting. "Quinn, we simply do not have time for these emotional outbursts. Desmond is a key player in a corporate asset that is about to explode in value. You are committing tortious interference with prospective economic advantage. You are jeopardizing tens of millions of dollars over a petty domestic dispute." He stepped forward purposefully, trying to use his height and his gender to intimidate me. "I manage high-level portfolios, Quinn. I deal with real money and real power every single day. If you do not unlock those accounts right now and stop interfering with Desmond's business, I will step in personally. I have a team of ruthless corporate lawyers who will tie you up in court for the next decade. I will use the full legal power of my hedge fund to freeze your personal assets, force a distress sale of this house, and leave you with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your back. You do not play games with corporate money like this. Now be a good girl, pull out your phone and fix this before I lose my patience." My mother beamed at him, practically swooning over his display of aggressive financial dominance. "See, Quinn?" she said proudly, gesturing toward her son-in-law. "Harrison knows how the real world works. He understands high finance. You need to listen to him before you destroy your own life." I looked at Harrison, staring at the shiny gold Rolex strapped to his wrist. It was a beautiful timepiece, but I knew for a documented fact he had bought it on credit. I looked into his cold, arrogant blue eyes, and I did not feel an ounce of fear. I felt an overwhelming, intoxicating sense of anticipation. Harrison thought he was the most powerful person in the room. He thought his threats of legal ruin and financial devastation would bring me trembling to my knees. He was completely unaware that as the shadow founder of Obsidian Ventures, I had unrestricted access to the deepest financial data in the global market. I spent my evenings analyzing market trends and investigating the very funds that men like Harrison claimed to run. I knew that his supposedly prestigious hedge fund was entirely insolvent. I knew that he was running a desperate and sloppy Ponzi scheme, using new investors' money to pay off the old ones just to keep the lights on in his rented office. And most importantly, I knew that the massive capital he had been recklessly gambling away on high-risk offshore derivatives for the last 6 months belonged to his biggest and most trusting client, my mother. I let a slow, quiet smirk spread across my face. I looked past Desmond, who was still fuming. I looked past Giselle, who was clinging to her husband's arm. I locked eyes directly with Harrison. "Are you absolutely sure you want to talk about freezing assets, Harrison?" I asked, my voice dropping to a deadly calm whisper that made the room suddenly go entirely silent. "Because we can certainly talk about what happens when a fund manager loses his liquidity. We could even talk about where Corinna's retirement money actually went this morning." The color drained from Harrison's face so fast he looked like he might pass out on my hardwood floor. Harrison stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He looked down at his expensive shoes and then back up at my face. The sheer terror in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his tight silk collar. Without another word to me, he grabbed Giselle by the elbow and turned toward the door. Giselle stumbled backward in her designer heels, whining about his sudden rough grip. Harrison ignored her complaints and practically dragged her out of my foyer. He did not look back. He did not issue any more legal threats. He just ran. Corinne and Desmond stood there completely baffled by the sudden retreat of their ultimate financial savior. My mother blinked in confusion, looking from the open doorway back to me. Desmond opened his mouth to hurl another insult, but I simply pointed toward the door. I told them both to leave my property before I called the local authorities to report them for trespassing. Corinne gathered her pride, lifting her chin and marching out the door, muttering about my unacceptable behavior. Desmond followed her, shooting me one last look of absolute venom. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them, leaving me in total silence. I slept incredibly well that night. The next morning, I woke up early and brewed a cup of premium dark roast coffee. The morning sun streamed through the massive windows of my kitchen, reflecting off the pristine marble countertops. I was enjoying the absolute peace of my home when the doorbell rang at precisely 8 o'clock. I walked to the door and checked the security monitor. A man in a plain gray suit was standing on my porch holding a thick manila envelope. I opened the door and he handed me the package, confirming my name before turning and walking away. I took the envelope to the kitchen island and sliced it open. It was a formal petition for divorce filed by Desmond's legal team. I spread the thick, crisp pages across the marble counter and began to read. The audacity of the document was truly breathtaking. Desmond was not just filing for a divorce. He was filing a comprehensive list of financial demands that bordered on sheer delusion. His lawyers had crafted a narrative painting him as the long-suffering breadwinner chained to a wife who actively hindered his professional ascent. He was demanding permanent spousal support. The legal filing claimed my lack of ambition, and my refusal to engage in high-level corporate networking had cost him multiple lucrative promotions over the past 6 years. He was formally requesting that the court award him full ownership of our suburban mansion, claiming he had made all the mortgage payments. He had absolutely no idea that I owned the mortgage company that held the note on the house. He also demanded half of my meager retirement savings and insisted I pay his legal fees for the divorce proceedings. The document accused me of severe emotional distress, citing the freezing of his credit cards the previous day as an act of malicious financial sabotage. Desmond wanted to bleed me dry to punish me for embarrassing him in front of his precious Victoria. I took a sip of my coffee and actually laughed out loud. The sheer arrogance of a man who used joint savings to buy a diamond ring for his mistress, now demanding alimony from his wife, was almost too perfect. I stacked the divorce papers neatly and placed them in a folder for my own legal team to tear apart later. Before I could even finish my coffee, my phone screen lit up with an incoming email notification. The sender was the Human Resources Department at Apex Tech. I opened the message and found a formal termination letter digitally signed by Victoria herself. She was firing me from my part-time administrative position. The wording of the letter was a masterpiece of corporate vindictiveness wrapped in professional jargon. Victoria stated that my employment was being terminated immediately due to gross insubordination and social incompetence. The letter detailed my failure to align with the elite corporate culture of Apex Tech. It claimed my presence in the office was a detriment to the fast-paced, highly driven environment they were cultivating for the initial public offering. Victoria added a personal note at the bottom of the email. She suggested I use my newfound free time to work on my interpersonal skills and perhaps find a job more suited to my limited capabilities. She informed me that my final paycheck for $400 would be mailed to my home address and that I was permanently banned from entering the Apex Tech building. She thought she was delivering a crushing blow to my self-esteem. She believed she was stripping away my only source of income and exiling me from her glamorous world. Victoria had no idea that I owned the physical building where she sat typing that email. She did not know that her entire salary was paid through a corporate structure that I entirely controlled. She was a puppet trying to fire the puppet master. I did not reply to her email. I did not call a labor attorney to fight the wrongful termination. I walked upstairs to my master bedroom and opened my expansive walk-in closet. I bypassed the plain conservative clothing I usually wore to play the part of Desmond's boring wife. I reached into the back of the closet and pulled out a sharply tailored charcoal pantsuit from a high-end boutique in Milan. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and black leather stiletto heels. I applied my makeup with careful precision, emphasizing my features rather than hiding them. I looked in the full-length mirror and saw the woman I truly was, the founder and chief executive officer of Obsidian Ventures. I gathered my leather briefcase and retrieved a highly encrypted flash drive from a hidden wall safe in my study. I also printed out a stack of documents totaling over 200 pages. This dossier was the result of 6 months of quiet investigation. I had known for a very long time that Desmond and Victoria were engaging in massive corporate fraud. I had watched them cook the books at Apex Tech to make the company look like a highly profitable unicorn startup for Wall Street investors. They were desperate to secure a massive valuation for the initial public offering. To achieve this, they had systematically categorized tens of millions of dollars in short-term operational liabilities as long-term equity. They had created thousands of phantom user accounts to artificially boost their daily active user metrics. They had forged revenue projections and hidden their massive debt in offshore shell companies. I drove my Porsche to the Federal Building in downtown Atlanta. I bypassed the regular entry line and used a private security clearance badge to access the upper floors. I walked directly into the regional office of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The intake officer looked up from his desk as I approached. I placed the thick printed dossier and the encrypted flash drive directly in front of him. I told him he would want to get these documents to the Director of Corporate Enforcement immediately. I explained that the files contained irrefutable time-stamped evidence of systemic financial fraud, embezzlement, and federal wire fraud occurring at Apex Tech. I provided the exact routing numbers for their hidden offshore accounts and the digital signatures linking Desmond and Victoria to the fraudulent ledger entries. The officer saw the detailed financial breakdown, and his eyes widened. I turned and walked out of the Federal Building, leaving a ticking time bomb squarely on Desmond's future. Later that afternoon, I was sitting in my home office reviewing international market trends when my phone buzzed with a text message from Corinne. My mother rarely texted me directly unless she wanted to issue a command. The message was characteristically demanding and completely devoid of any maternal warmth. It ordered me to attend a mandatory family dinner at her house that evening at 7:00 sharp. The text stated that we needed to handle the situation with the house quietly and efficiently before Desmond was forced to take the matter public. She told me to bring a pen and a cooperative attitude. I knew exactly what kind of trap they were trying to set. They believed I was vulnerable and desperate after being served with divorce papers and a termination letter on the same day. They thought they could pressure me into signing away my assets to protect the family reputation. I decided to attend the dinner. I wanted to see exactly how far their delusion would stretch. I wanted to watch them dig their own graves with absolute certainty. I arrived at my mother's sprawling estate in the most exclusive gated community in the city. The driveway was lined with imported luxury vehicles. I parked my car and walked through the heavy double doors into the grand foyer. Corinne's house was a monument to excessive displays of wealth. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings and expensive abstract art covered the walls. I walked into the formal dining room where the long mahogany table was set with heavy sterling silver flatware and fine china. The tension in the room was palpable and thick. Desmond was sitting near the head of the table right next to my mother. He looked incredibly smug, wearing a fresh designer suit and sipping from a crystal tumbler of expensive bourbon. Giselle was sitting across from him, scrolling mindlessly on her phone while picking at a salad. Harrison was standing near the built-in bar, pouring himself a very large drink. He looked slightly pale, but he puffed out his chest as soon as I entered the room, desperately trying to project an aura of alpha male dominance. Corinne sat at the head of the table, wearing a condescending smile. "Take a seat, Quinn," my mother commanded, gesturing to a chair at the far end of the table. "We have a lot of important business to discuss, and very little time to waste." I pulled out the chair and sat down, placing my leather briefcase on the floor beside me. I looked at Desmond, who gave me a patronizing little wave. He thought his aggressive divorce filing had broken my spirit. He thought his mistress firing me had crushed my self-worth. "Desmond and I have spoken extensively today." Corinne began, clasping her hands together on the table. "He has been incredibly gracious given your erratic and damaging behavior yesterday. He is willing to settle this divorce quickly and quietly to save us all the embarrassment of a public court battle. All you have to do is be reasonable for once in your life." Desmond slid a thick legal document across the polished wood table toward me. It was a quitclaim deed. They wanted me to sign over all my rights to my own house. The document explicitly transferred full ownership of the property directly to Desmond. "Sign it, Quinn," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You have no job now. You cannot afford the upkeep on a house like that anyway. Sign the deed and I will tell my lawyers to drop the claim for spousal support. It is a very generous offer considering you tried to ruin my company today. Before I could even respond to his ridiculous demand, Harrison stepped forward from the bar. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass and smiled broadly. He looked around the room, making sure all eyes were on him. There was no need to worry about the company anymore, he announced, his voice booming through the dining room. I stepped in and handled the situation like a true professional. I could not let a petty domestic dispute derail a highly lucrative corporate asset. Giselle looked up from her phone and beamed at her husband. Harrison is an absolute genius, she declared loudly. Tell her what you did, darling. Tell her how you saved the day. Harrison took a slow sip of his drink and looked down at me with an expression of supreme triumph. When Obsidian Ventures pulled their backing this morning, it caused a slight liquidity issue for Apex Tech. The banks got nervous. The board started panicking. But as a premier fund manager, I know how to stabilize a volatile market. I personally injected $20 million of emergency capital into Apex Tech this afternoon. I covered the bank glitch caused by your little stunt, Quinn. The initial public offering is back on track for tomorrow morning. I am now a major equity stakeholder in the company, and Desmond is completely protected. Corinne clapped her hands together in sheer delight. That is what real men do, she proclaimed proudly. They fix problems. They secure the future. We are so incredibly blessed to have Harrison in this family. Now, Quinn, stop being difficult and sign the deed so we can enjoy our dinner. I looked at the quitclaim deed sitting on the table in front of me. I looked at Desmond, who was grinning like a lottery winner. I looked at my mother, who was glowing with pride over her white knight son-in-law. And finally, I looked at Harrison, who was standing there believing he had just outsmarted a Wall Street giant. I did not reach for the pen. I simply leaned back in my chair and let out a soft, genuine laugh. The sound echoed through the quiet dining room, cutting through their thick layer of smug satisfaction. The smiles on their faces began to falter slightly. I stood up slowly, smoothing out the jacket of my tailored suit. I placed both hands on the edge of the mahogany table and leaned forward, looking directly into Harrison's arrogant blue eyes. You injected $20 million into Apex Tech, I asked, my voice perfectly calm and steady. That is a very impressive display of liquidity, Harrison. It truly is. I just have one quick question about your brilliant financial rescue mission. The room was entirely silent. Harrison stopped swirling his drink. His jaw tightened just a fraction. Did you happen to tell your beloved mother-in-law? I continued, keeping my eyes locked on his pale face, exactly where that $20 million came from. Did you explain to Corinne that her white knight just completely drained the family charity trust to cover his reckless gambling? Did you tell her that you emptied every single penny of her personal retirement accounts this morning just to buy worthless equity in a company that is currently being investigated for massive federal fraud? The crystal glass slipped from Harrison's hand and shattered violently against the hardwood floor. The sound of the shattered crystal glass hung in the silent dining room for what felt like an eternity. Harrison stared at the glittering shards scattered across my mother's expensive Persian rug, his face completely drained of its usual arrogant flush. He looked as though the floor had suddenly dropped out from beneath him. My mother, Corinne, immediately motioned for the housekeeper to clean up the mess, her eyes darting nervously between her golden son-in-law and me. She absolutely refused to acknowledge the heavy implication of the financial truth I had just laid bare in the middle of her elegant dinner party. Instead, she simply doubled down on her lifelong delusion. Corinne smoothed the napkin on her lap and cleared her throat, pretending the sudden panic radiating from Harrison was nothing more than a minor social faux pas. Let us not get distracted by wild accusations, she said, her voice tight with forced civility. Desmond has a massive day tomorrow with the initial public offering. We are here to handle family business, so he does not have to worry about tying up loose ends. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the legal document resting on the polished mahogany table in front of me. Just sign the quitclaim deed, Quinn. Sign over the house and you can leave. Desmond tapped an expensive fountain pen against the thick stack of divorce papers. He leaned back in his chair, completely ignoring the fact that Harrison looked like a man standing on the gallows. Desmond was too wrapped up in his own impending glory to notice the smell of blood in the water. "Just sign it, Quinn," he said, his tone laced with a bored, patronizing irritation. "You are making a fool of yourself trying to play financial analyst. You do not understand how corporate liquidity works. Harrison is a master of wealth management. If he says he injected $20 million to bridge the gap caused by your little temper tantrum, then he did. Now stop holding up my evening. Victoria is waiting for me at the hotel to finalize the press release for tomorrow morning." I did not reach for the pen. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap and shifted my gaze back to Harrison. He was gripping the edge of the dining table so tightly his knuckles were stark white. He was trying desperately to regain his frat boy swagger to pull the mask of the elite Wall Street insider back over his face. "You injected $20 million of emergency capital," I repeated, keeping my voice completely level and conversational. "That is fascinating, Harrison. It really is a marvel of modern finance. Because according to the mandatory public disclosures filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission last quarter, your boutique hedge fund was severely overleveraged. In fact, your assets under management had dropped so drastically that you were facing multiple margin calls. So please enlighten me. Tell your brother-in-law exactly how a fund with zero liquidity managed to wire $20 million of clean, untraceable cash into Apex Tech in less than 4 hours without triggering a massive federal red flag." Harrison swallowed hard. A bead of sweat formed at his hairline and slowly tracked down his temple. He adjusted his silk tie as if it were suddenly choking him. "We utilized a dynamic mezzanine bridge loan." He stammered, his voice lacking its usual booming confidence. "It was a discretionary allocation from our offshore reserves. You would not understand the mechanisms, Quinn. It is highly sophisticated institutional investing. We bypass traditional banking bottlenecks to provide immediate liquidity for premier tech assets like Desmond's company." I let out a soft, genuine laugh. The sound seemed to rattle him even more. "A dynamic mezzanine bridge loan," I said, tilting my head. "That is a lot of impressive jargon to cover up a very simple and very illegal transaction. You do not have offshore reserves, Harrison. You do not have institutional backing. What you do have is full discretionary control over the Oak Bluffs Community Endowment Fund." My mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest. The Oak Bluffs Community Endowment was her absolute pride and joy. It was the charitable trust she had spent the last 2 decades building alongside the most elite Black families in Martha's Vineyard. It was her crowning social achievement, the very foundation of her status in high society. 2 years ago, she had practically begged the board of directors to let her brilliant white son-in-law manage the massive fund, promising them astronomical returns. "Do not you dare bring the endowment into this." Corinne snapped, her voice trembling with sudden defensive rage. "Harrison has doubled the foundation's portfolio since he took over. He has secured our legacy for generations." I looked at my mother, feeling a brief, fleeting pang of pity for how completely she had been conned. "He has not doubled anything, Mother," I said softly. "He has been printing fake quarterly statements on his home computer. He has been running a textbook Ponzi scheme using new money from your wealthy friends to pay off the old investors just to maintain the illusion of profitability. And this afternoon, when Desmond called him in an absolute panic because I pulled the actual venture capital out of Apex Tech, Harrison made a fatal mistake. He panicked. He needed to look like the savior. So he bypassed the board approval and illegally wired $20 million directly from the charity trust into a sinking tech company." "That is an absolute lie," Giselle shrieked, slamming her hand on the table. My sister glared at me, her beautiful face contorted with pure hatred. "You are so violently jealous of my husband and my marriage that you are literally making up financial crimes just to ruin our dinner. Harrison is a genius. He comes from a family of prominent bankers. He would never touch a charity fund. You are just bitter because Desmond finally woke up and realized he was married to a miserable, unkempt loser who holds him back. Desmond is going to ring the bell at the stock exchange tomorrow, and you are going to be sitting in a cheap apartment eating frozen dinners. Sign the deed and get out of our sight." Harrison tried to seize the momentum Giselle provided. He forced a harsh, condescending laugh that sounded entirely unnatural. "This is pathetic, Quinn," he said, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are grasping at straws because you know you have lost. You locked Desmond out of his checking account, so you think you are some kind of financial mastermind? I deal with regulatory compliance every day. My fund is audited by the best firms in the country. You are making defamatory statements, and I will personally sue you for slander the minute this dinner is over." Desmond shook his head in disgust. "Let her talk, Harrison. Let her embarrass herself. She is just trying to distract us from the fact that she has no leverage, she has no job, she has no future." He pushed the quitclaim deed closer to me. "I am giving you one last chance to do this the easy way, Quinn. Sign the house over to me. It is the least you can do after bringing nothing to this marriage for 6 years. Victoria and I need the property for our real estate portfolio. It will serve as a lovely guest house for our visiting investors once the initial public offering makes us billionaires." The sheer magnitude of their collective delusion was breathtaking. They were sitting in a burning house complaining about the temperature of the soup. Desmond genuinely believed his initial public offering was still happening. Harrison genuinely believed he could bluff his way out of federal wire fraud with a few big words. Giselle genuinely believed her husband was a financial titan. And my mother genuinely believed her social standing was secure. I slowly stood up from the dining chair. I did not touch the pen. I did not look at the quitclaim deed. I reached down and picked up my leather briefcase, placing it gently on the polished mahogany table. The room went completely still as I popped the brass clasps open. "You all seem incredibly confident in your respective futures," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the large dining room. "You truly believe that tomorrow morning the sun is going to rise and shower you all with unimaginable wealth and status. Desmond, you believe Victoria is your brilliant corporate queen. Harrison, you believe your Ponzi scheme is safely hidden behind fake spreadsheets. And Mother, you believe your golden son-in-law has secured your place in high society forever." I reached into the briefcase and pulled out a single crisp sheet of heavy bond paper. It was not a printed email. It was a formal legal document bearing the deeply embossed blue seal of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. But the reality of this situation is much less glamorous. I continued holding the document in my hand. The reality is that Apex Tech is a fraudulent shell company carrying tens of millions in hidden debt. The reality is that Victoria is a figurehead who has been falsifying user metrics to secure further funding. And the reality is that the only reason the company survived this long is because my venture capital firm allowed it to. Desmond let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Your venture capital firm? Are you actually insane? You are a part-time administrative assistant. You organize files for a mid-level logistics company. You do not even know what venture capital means." I ignored his outburst and slid the document across the long table. It glided over the polished wood and came to a stop directly in front of Harrison, not in front of Desmond, not in front of my mother, but directly in front of the man who actually understood the terrifying weight of what the document represented. Harrison looked down at the paper. It was a formal notice of an expedited federal audit and a temporary freezing of all assets associated with Apex Tech and its immediate subsidiaries, pending an investigation into massive corporate fraud. This afternoon, I filed a comprehensive anonymous dossier with the Federal Enforcement Division. I said, my voice cold and absolute. I provided them with the exact server logs proving Desmond and Victoria have been cooking the books for 2 years. And because Harrison decided to aggressively link his hedge fund to Apex Tech by wiring $20 million of stolen charity money across state lines this afternoon, he has successfully tied his own sinking ship to Desmond's burning building. The federal agents are not just looking at Apex Tech anymore, Harrison. They are looking at the origin of that emergency bridge loan. They are looking directly at the Oak Bluffs Community Endowment. Desmond threw his head back and laughed again, a loud, obnoxious sound that grated against the walls. "This is hilarious," he said, wiping a fake tear from his eye. "You printed out a fake government letter from the internet to try and scare us. You are literally losing your mind, Quinn. It is sad. It really is." "Harrison, tell her how stupid she looks right now." But Harrison did not speak. He did not laugh. He did not assure Desmond that it was a fake document printed from the internet. Harrison was staring at the blue seal on the paper. The arrogant flush had completely left his face, replacing it with a sickly pale gray. He recognized the specific regulatory codes printed on the notice. He recognized the exact legal terminology used by federal investigators when a fund manager is about to be raided. The illusion of his power was shattering in real time. "Harrison, say something," Giselle demanded, her voice pitching higher with sudden anxiety as she looked at her husband's terrified expression. "Tell her she is crazy. Tell her to get out of our mother's house." Harrison tried to reach for his water glass to take a sip, but his hands were trembling so violently he could not even wrap his fingers around the crystal. The glass tipped over, spilling ice water across the mahogany table and soaking the edges of Desmond's precious quitclaim deed. Harrison simply sat there, paralyzed, his eyes wide with the realization of his own impending doom. He was looking at a decade in a federal penitentiary, and he knew it. I fastened the clasps of my briefcase and picked it up. I looked down the table at the people who had spent their entire lives trying to make me feel small. "You should keep that quitclaim deed, Desmond," I said softly, walking toward the archway of the dining room. "You are going to need a lot of scrap paper to write your apologies to the investors tomorrow. And Mother, I highly suggest you call the board of directors for your charity endowment tonight. It is always better when they hear about the missing $20 million directly from the source before they read about it in the morning papers." I did not wait for their responses. I walked out of the dining room, my heels clicking steadily against the marble floors of the grand foyer. As I pulled the heavy front door open and stepped out into the cool evening air, I could hear the sudden chaotic eruption of shouting from the dining room behind me. Giselle was screaming at Harrison. Desmond was yelling about his initial public offering, and my mother was demanding answers. I closed the door behind me, shutting out their noise. The dinner of delusion was officially over, and the true nightmare for my family was just beginning. I drove back to my quiet suburban house, leaving the chaos of my mother's dining room miles behind me. The federal audit notice was sitting on that mahogany table, ticking like a bomb, but Desmond and Victoria were entirely too arrogant to stop their own momentum. They genuinely believed that their fake injection of $20 million from Harrison's stolen charity fund had saved them. By 6 o'clock the next morning, the massive flat-screen monitors in my home office were glowing with the broadcast feeds of 3 different financial news networks. Desmond and Victoria were sitting side by side on a plush studio couch, smiling into the high-definition cameras for a live television interview. They looked like the absolute perfect corporate power couple. Victoria wore a sharp white tailored dress that contrasted with her perfectly blown-out hair, and Desmond was in his signature bespoke suit. The stolen 5-carat diamond flashed brilliantly on Victoria's finger every time she gestured to the news anchor. The interviewer leaned forward and asked about the sudden rumors of financial instability circulating in the dark pools of the market and the abrupt departure of their anonymous backing capital just days before the initial public offering. Victoria did not even blink. Her face remained a mask of serene corporate confidence. She leaned into the microphone and unleashed a highly calculated and deeply vicious smear campaign on live national television. She claimed the sudden capital withdrawal was not a reflection of Apex Tech's financial health, but rather a personal vendetta orchestrated by a deranged and deeply jealous ex-wife. Desmond nodded solemnly beside her, playing the part of the long-suffering victim to absolute perfection. He looked directly into the camera with manufactured sadness in his eyes and said it was a profound tragedy when toxic personal grievances attempted to sabotage Black excellence in the tech industry. They framed my absolute silence over the past 48 hours as an admission of guilt. They painted me as a bitter, uneducated, and unsophisticated administrative assistant who simply could not handle her husband's meteoric rise to success. They told the world that I had suffered a mental breakdown because I lacked the social competence to exist in their elite circles. My phone buzzed relentlessly on my desk. Notifications poured in from distant relatives, college acquaintances, and anonymous social media accounts who had seen the morning interview. People who had not spoken to me in years were suddenly leaving voicemails, calling me petty, vindictive, and embarrassing to the culture. My sister Giselle even posted a lengthy status update on her various social media platforms, condemning my actions and praising Desmond and Victoria for standing strong against my toxic jealousy. My own sister was rallying her pageant queens and country club friends to drag my name through the mud. She was actively participating in my public execution while completely ignoring the terrifying reality that her husband had just incinerated her mother's entire retirement fund. A weaker woman would have taken to the internet to desperately defend herself. I could have easily posted the federal audit documents for the world to see. I could have published the joint bank statements proving Desmond drained our accounts to buy that engagement ring. I could have gone on a prominent podcast and aired every dirty secret my family had ever buried under their designer rugs. But absolute power does not need to shout to be heard. Absolute power operates in total silence until the exact moment it decides to strike. I closed all the social media tabs on my monitors and opened my highly encrypted communication portal. I dialed the direct private line for Jonathan at Obsidian Ventures. My voice was perfectly steady and devoid of any emotional fluctuation as I gave him his next set of instructions. I did not want to just destroy Desmond and Victoria. That was already in motion with the federal authorities. I wanted to ensure that my mother, my sister, and my arrogant brother-in-law could never escape the consequences of their betrayal. They wanted to play high-stakes financial warfare, so I was going to buy the entire battlefield. I instructed Jonathan to immediately target Harrison's failing hedge fund. Harrison thought he was incredibly smart moving money through offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands to cover his massive trading losses. But debt in the high finance world is simply another commodity waiting to be purchased by someone with enough liquidity. I told Jonathan to aggressively buy up the entirety of Harrison's bad debt. Every defaulted margin call, every leveraged asset, every toxic piece of commercial paper his fund had issued over the last 2 years needed to be acquired. I wanted Obsidian Ventures to own every single cent of it. Jonathan worked with his usual ruthless and terrifying efficiency. It took his team less than 48 hours to execute the complex acquisitions. The massive banking institutions and private lenders who were currently hunting Harrison down were absolutely thrilled to offload his toxic debt for pennies on the dollar. They thought they were simply cutting their losses before his fund officially collapsed. They had absolutely no idea they were handing me the master keys to my family's entire kingdom. By Thursday afternoon, the transactions were finalized and fully legally binding. I sat at my desk and reviewed the consolidated portfolio Jonathan sent over. It was a masterpiece of financial leverage. I now owned $74 million of Harrison's direct liabilities. If he failed to meet the repayment terms, which I knew for a documented fact, he could not, because he had just dumped his last $20 million of stolen charity money into Apex Tech. I had the absolute legal right to seize everything he possessed. I could foreclose on the luxury penthouse he shared with Giselle in the city. I could seize his imported vehicles. I could legally lay claim to my mother's sprawling suburban estate because Harrison had foolishly used it as collateral to secure his initial round of funding years ago. I was no longer just the scapegoat daughter or the boring, invisible ex-wife. I was legally the single largest creditor my family had ever known. I held their entire existence in the palm of my hand. The weekend approached with a heavy, suffocating tension in the financial markets, but Apex Tech was still blindly pushing forward with their plans. Desmond and Victoria were actively ignoring the federal subpoenas that were undoubtedly piling up on their desks, believing their own media spin would somehow save them from prison. They were hosting a massive black tie event at the Ritz-Carlton to celebrate both their engagement and the upcoming initial public offering. I was drinking my morning green tea when the private courier arrived at my security gate. He handed over a thick, glossy black envelope sealed with heavy gold wax. I took it back to the kitchen island and broke the seal. Inside was a heavy cardstock VIP invitation to the Apex Tech corporate gala. But it was not sent as a genuine gesture of inclusion or reconciliation. Tucked behind the thick invitation was a handwritten note from Desmond and a certified cashier's check. I pulled the check out and stared at the bold printed amount. $10,000. I unfolded the handwritten note. Desmond's arrogant, sprawling handwriting filled the page. The note was dripping with toxic condescension and unearned superiority. He told me to use the money to pay my bills and buy myself a nice, quiet life somewhere far away from his success. He said the invitation was just a formality sent to all the old administrative staff, but he highly recommended I stay home and avoid embarrassing myself in a room full of actual elites. He ended the note by stating that Victoria felt sorry for me and wanted me to have the money as a parting charity gift for my years of mundane service. They actually thought they could buy my absence. They thought $10,000 was a massive windfall for a woman they still perceived as a lowly, socially incompetent paper pusher. They truly believed I was sitting in my house crying over their television interviews and feeling completely defeated by their public success. They wanted me to know the party was happening just so I could suffer in the knowledge that I was not welcome in their glamorous world. I did not rip the check up. I did not burn the invitation in the sink. I set them both neatly on the marble counter and let out a long, slow breath. The sheer unmitigated gall of these people was the exact fuel I needed for my final act. They wanted a public spectacle. They wanted to celebrate their corporate empire and their fake love story in front of hundreds of investors, media outlets, and high society elites. They wanted the brightest spotlight possible to validate their delusions. I decided it was only fair that I gave them exactly what they asked for. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my private contacts until I found the direct line for a highly exclusive bespoke designer based in New York. She was a woman who only worked with top-tier elite clients and usually required months of advance notice just for an initial fitting. But she also knew exactly who I was, and she understood the massive financial power wielded by Obsidian Ventures. She answered on the second ring. I did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. I told her I needed a custom power suit tailored to my exact measurements and delivered to Atlanta by tomorrow afternoon. I told her I did not care what it cost or who she had to push aside to make it happen. She asked what color I wanted the fabric to be. I looked down at the shiny gold lettering on Desmond's mocking invitation. I thought about the blood he had tried to draw from my heart, the financial ruin he had tried to inflict upon my future, and the absolute massacre I was about to unleash on his entire world. Make it crimson red, I said, my voice dropping to a cool, commanding register that left no room for debate. The deepest, darkest red you have in your studio. I want them to see me coming the exact moment I walk through the doors. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the counter. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the kitchen window. I was no longer the quiet, supportive wife who shrank into the background so her arrogant husband could shine. I was no longer the obedient scapegoat daughter who swallowed insults to keep the peace at toxic family dinners. The woman staring back at me was a predator who had spent the last week quietly circling her prey, learning their weaknesses and buying up their debts. Desmond and Victoria thought they had successfully locked me out of the castle. They had absolutely no idea that I already owned the ground it was built on. The gala was supposed to be their crowning achievement. Instead, it was going to be their highly publicized public execution. I was going to walk into that ballroom in a crimson red suit and I was going to burn their entire house of cards to the ground. The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton was a suffocating ocean of fake smiles and stolen wealth. I pulled up to the valet entrance in a sleek black town car. The evening air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and desperate ambition. When the driver opened my door, I stepped out onto the pristine red carpet, and the entire atmosphere of the entrance seemed to physically shift. The custom crimson red suit fit me like a second skin. It was tailored with absolute lethal precision, sharp angles, and a plunging neckline that radiated pure, unadulterated power. The fabric moved with a fluid, dangerous grace. I wore no jewelry, no distraction from the sheer force of my presence. As I walked into the grand lobby, heads began to turn. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The paparazzi stationed near the entrance completely abandoned the minor tech influencers they were photographing and immediately turned their blinding flashes toward me. I was a walking inferno in a sea of boring corporate black and white. Inside the massive ballroom, Desmond and Victoria were holding court near an elaborate ice sculpture of the Apex Tech logo. Victoria was wearing a ridiculously ostentatious silver gown that looked more like a wedding dress than corporate attire. She was laughing loudly at a joke made by a wealthy venture capitalist when her eyes locked onto mine across the room. Her smile froze completely. The champagne glass in her hand trembled, spilling pale gold liquid onto the polished floor. Desmond followed her terrified gaze, and the color instantly drained from his face. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost walk out of a burning building. He desperately tried to maintain his billionaire posture, but his eyes betrayed the absolute terror of a man who realized he was no longer in control. He dropped his confident facade and frantically gestured to the perimeter security team. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me, barking desperate orders into the ear of the closest guard. I watched him panic with a deep, lingering satisfaction. 4 massive men in dark suits immediately detached themselves from the walls and marched toward me. Desmond leaned over the VIP railing, a smug, relieved smirk spreading across his face. He expected them to grab me by the arm and physically drag me out into the street. The head of hotel security, a tall, intimidating man named Marcus, reached me first. Desmond shouted across the lobby, demanding that Marcus physically remove the deranged woman who was trespassing on his private event. But Marcus did not grab my arm. He did not ask to see my invitation. Marcus was on the direct payroll of Obsidian Ventures. Jonathan had quietly bought the absolute loyalty of the Ritz-Carlton security detail 3 hours ago for a price Desmond could not even fathom. Marcus simply stopped in front of me, gave a sharp, respectful nod, and stepped smoothly to the side. He extended his hand toward the main ballroom doors and told me the path was clear. Desmond's jaw practically unhinged. He watched in absolute horror as his own hired security detail formed a protective barrier around me, gently pushing aside the whispering crowds to ensure my flawless entry. I had barely made it past the grand floral arrangements when 2 figures stepped directly into my path, blocking the entrance to the main floor. It was my mother Corinne and my sister Giselle. They looked like cornered animals desperate to protect the fading illusion of their social dominance. Corinne's face was flushed with absolute rage, her expensive silk wrap pulled tightly around her shoulders. Giselle was glaring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, her hands balled into tight fists at her sides. "What do you think you are doing here, Quinn?" my mother hissed. Her voice kept low to avoid a public scene, but vibrating with venom. "You are an absolute embarrassment. Desmond was kind enough to send you a generous parting gift, and instead of taking the hint, you show up here trying to ruin his night. You are sick. You are violently jealous, and you need to leave before I call the police myself." Giselle stepped closer, trying to use her height to intimidate me. "You look pathetic," she spat, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "That cheap red suit is not going to change the fact that you are a boring administrative assistant who got dumped for a better woman. Harrison is finalizing a massive deal tonight that is going to make us billions. We are entering a completely different stratosphere of wealth, and you are just a miserable ex-wife desperate for attention. Get out of our way before we have you thrown into the street like the trash you are." I did not raise my voice. I did not shrink back. I simply looked at my mother and my sister, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, clinical pity for their massive delusion. I smiled a sharp, terrifying smile that made them both step back involuntarily. "Harrison is not finalizing anything tonight, Giselle," I said, my tone perfectly level and conversational. "Harrison is currently hiding in the bathroom of his penthouse trying to figure out how to explain to his investors why Obsidian Ventures just bought $74 million of his defaulted debt. He is finished and you are going down with him. And Mother, I highly suggest you enjoy the expensive champagne tonight, because tomorrow morning the federal investigators are going to seize this entire hotel, along with your precious charity endowment. Now step aside." They were so paralyzed by the absolute certainty in my voice that they could not even formulate a response. They physically shrank back against the floral displays as I walked right between them, the crimson-red fabric of my suit brushing past their trembling hands. I entered the main ballroom, just as the heavy orchestral music faded into a triumphant corporate anthem. The massive digital screens surrounding the room flashed with the golden Apex Tech logo. Hundreds of wealthy investors, socialites, and industry elites turned their attention to the grand stage at the center of the room. Desmond was practically running up the stairs, pulling a terrified Victoria along behind him. He was sweating profusely, but he forced a blinding, charismatic smile as he grabbed the microphone from the stand. He raised his hand and the crowd erupted into polite applause. "Welcome, everyone, to the dawn of a new era!" He boomed, his voice echoing through the massive ballroom. "Tonight, we are not just celebrating the future of Apex Tech. We are celebrating the absolute triumph of innovation. In exactly 60 seconds, we are going to press this ceremonial button and officially initiate our public offering. We are going to change the world." Victoria stood beside him, gripping his arm so tightly her knuckles were stark white. She forced a beautiful empty smile for the flashing cameras, but her eyes were darting frantically around the room, searching for me. The crowd began a slow, rhythmic clap as an illuminated podium was wheeled onto the center of the stage, featuring a massive red button. Desmond raised his hand over the button, preparing to cement his fake legacy. I did not stop walking. I moved with absolute lethal purpose, cutting straight through the center of the crowd. The wealthy investors parted like the Red Sea, completely mesmerized by the sheer confidence radiating from my every step. The crimson-red suit caught the harsh stage lights, making me look like an avenging angel walking out of the flames. Desmond saw me approaching the stairs, and his forced smile completely collapsed. He frantically signaled for Marcus to stop me, but Marcus just stood at the back of the room watching with a blank expression. I walked gracefully up the velvet stairs, my heels clicking in perfect rhythm with the fading applause. Victoria let out a sharp gasp and took a step back, nearly tripping over the hem of her ridiculous silver gown. Desmond froze his hand, hovering uselessly over the ceremonial button. He tried to speak, to tell me to get off his stage, but his throat was completely dry. I walked right up to him. I did not look angry. I did not look jealous. I looked like absolute, undeniable authority. I reached out and gently took the microphone directly from his trembling hand. He was so completely paralyzed by shock that he surrendered it without a single fight. I turned to face the massive crowd of investors and elites looking out over the sea of confused and expectant faces. The room fell into a deathly terrifying silence. I smiled into the blinding lights, ready to deliver the final fatal blow. "Welcome, shareholders," I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom. The silence in the room was so absolute that you could hear the soft hum of the massive digital screens behind the main stage. I am Quinn, the founder and sole proprietor of Obsidian Ventures. I looked directly at the sea of wealthy investors who had come to pour their money into a sinking ship. I watched the confusion ripple through the crowd of elite socialites and tech billionaires. They were staring at my crimson-red suit, trying to understand how a woman they did not recognize had just commandeered the most anticipated financial event of the year. As of this morning, Obsidian Ventures holds exactly 89% of the controlling shares in Apex Tech. I raised my free hand and snapped my fingers. The massive screens behind me instantly dropped the glowing golden Apex Tech logo. In its place, the screens illuminated with the true and terrifying corporate ownership structure. The intricate web of shell companies, hidden debts, and offshore accounts was laid bare for every single investor to see. The digital charts clearly showed Obsidian Ventures at the absolute top of the pyramid. The arrows on the screen linked every single toxic asset Desmond had tried to hide directly back to my holding company. I wanted them to see the exact numerical proof of his absolute failure. The $647 million of backing capital that was promised to secure this initial public offering has been officially and permanently withdrawn, I announced, the crimson-red fabric of my suit catching the harsh stage lights. This initial public offering is completely dead, and Apex Tech is officially insolvent. The entire ballroom erupted into a collective gasp of pure, unadulterated horror. The sound of hundreds of panicked whispers filled the air as investors scrambled to pull out their phones to check the market. Wealthy venture capitalists were shouting at their brokers, demanding to know how they had been so completely blinded. Victoria let out a feral shriek that sounded entirely inhuman. The serene mask of the brilliant corporate queen completely dissolved into an ugly display of pure hatred. She lunged across the stage, her hands raised, aiming a violent slap directly at my face. She did not even make it halfway across the polished floor. Marcus stepped out of the shadows with terrifying speed. He caught her wrist in a vice grip, effortlessly spinning her around and forcing her back. Victoria stumbled in her heavy silver gown. Her perfect hair fell across her face as she shrieked obscenities at me. Her designer heels scraped against the wood as she fought against the massive security guard, but Marcus did not budge an inch. Suddenly, the heavy crystal chandeliers above us began to flicker. The deep wail of police sirens pierced through the thick walls of the Ritz-Carlton, growing louder and more frantic by the second. The flashing red and blue lights painted the ballroom windows in a chaotic, frantic rhythm. Desmond let out a loud, manic laugh that bordered on complete hysteria. He refused to accept that his empire was crumbling into dust. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "You are crazy, Quinn!" He shouted, his voice cracking under the strain of his own massive delusion. "Security called the cops on you for trespassing. You are going to a psychiatric ward, and I am going to sue you for every single penny you have ever made. You think you can just walk in here and ruin my life with a fake presentation? The police are going to drag you out of here in a straitjacket." The heavy double doors of the ballroom burst open with a deafening crash. A dozen men and women in dark windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation marched directly into the room. Their heavy boots echoed against the marble floors. They did not stop to ask for invitations. They did not look at the elite crowd of billionaires and socialites who were now frantically backing away toward the walls. They walked with absolute calculated precision straight toward the stage. Desmond stepped forward, adjusting his bespoke suit and pointing down at me. "Arrest that woman," he demanded, trying to sound like a billionaire executive commanding his troops. "She is a deranged ex-wife who hacked our presentation and trespassed on a private corporate event. She is a complete lunatic and she needs to be removed immediately." The lead federal agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man, did not even glance in my direction. He walked straight past Desmond and headed directly for Harrison, who was trying desperately to slip out through the side exit of the ballroom. Two agents flanked Harrison, instantly grabbing his arms and pulling them violently behind his back. The sharp click of metal handcuffs echoed over the frantic whispers of the crowd. "Harrison Adams, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, money laundering, and the operation of a massive financial Ponzi scheme," the lead agent stated, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." My sister Giselle let out a piercing scream from the lobby entrance, pushing her way through the thick crowd of terrified investors. She threw herself at the agents, demanding they release her brilliant husband, claiming it was all a massive misunderstanding. She hit their tactical vests with her small fists, sobbing hysterically. Harrison just hung his head, his face completely gray and devoid of any arrogant swagger. He knew the fake spreadsheets and the stolen community endowment funds had finally caught up to him. He looked like a deflated balloon, completely stripped of his frat boy confidence. Two other federal agents stepped onto the stage and approached Victoria and Desmond. Victoria tried to back away, but her ridiculous silver gown snagged on a microphone wire. Desmond finally realized the police were not there for me. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape that did not exist. He looked at the agents and then at the massive screens displaying the criminal ownership structure. "Desmond Hayes and Victoria Vance, you are both under arrest for corporate embezzlement, massive investor fraud, and the falsification of federal financial disclosures," the agent said, pulling out a second pair of heavy metal handcuffs. "We have the complete server logs and financial records provided directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission earlier today." The color drained entirely from Desmond's face. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The illusion of his power was shattering in real time in front of the very people he had spent his entire life trying to impress. The investors were already rushing for the exits, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Apex tech collapse. Desmond looked at me, his eyes wide with a sudden terrifying realization. The server logs, the anonymous data drop, the $74 million of defaulted debt. It all clicked into place in his frantic mind. He realized that the quiet administrative assistant he had thrown away was the very architect of his absolute destruction. He realized that the parent company that now legally owned all his assets was Obsidian Ventures. I owned the debt that secured his home, his cars, and the very clothes on his back. Every single asset he thought he possessed was legally owned by my holding company. He was completely broke. He had absolutely nothing left to his name. He fell to his knees right there on the polished stage. The bespoke suit wrinkled around his shaking frame as he looked up at me. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a pathetic, sniveling desperation. He looked like a drowning man begging for a life raft. "Quinn, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "Please do not do this. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. Victoria manipulated me. She forced me to cook the books. She is the one who wanted the money. I still love you, Quinn. We can fix this. You have the $647 million. You can pay the fines. You can save the company and we can start over. Please, Quinn, I am begging you to help me." Victoria shrieked and tried to kick him as the agent secured her wrists. She screamed that he was a weak, pathetic coward and that it was all his fault. They were tearing each other apart right in front of the flashing cameras. I looked down at the man who had spent 6 years making me feel completely invisible. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no lingering affection. Just the cold, empty satisfaction of watching a parasite finally meet its end. I did not say a single word to him. I did not need to. The federal agents hauled him to his feet, roughly yanking his arms behind his back and securing the handcuffs. Victoria was screaming wildly, thrashing against the agents as they dragged her off the stage, her stolen diamond ring catching the flashing police lights. Down in the crowd, my mother Corinne stood completely paralyzed. The reality of Harrison's arrest was slowly penetrating her thick layer of denial. She had begged the board of directors to let Harrison manage the Oak Bluffs Community Endowment Fund. She had trusted him with her entire life savings, her retirement accounts, and the deed to the sprawling suburban mansion she loved more than anything in the world. She realized in that exact moment that every single cent was gone. Harrison had leveraged all of it to cover his toxic debts, and I was the one who had bought those exact debts. She had absolutely nothing left to secure her precious social standing. Corinne's eyes rolled back in her head and she collapsed onto the ballroom floor in a dead faint. The crowd parted around her, unwilling to touch the disgraced matriarch of a fallen family. Giselle stopped screaming at the agents and rushed to our mother's side, shaking her shoulders frantically. She slapped her cheeks, trying to wake her up from the nightmare. A few moments later, Corinne gasped for air and her eyes fluttered open. She looked up and saw me standing on the edge of the stage, looking down at the absolute wreckage of my family. She scrambled to her feet, pushing Giselle aside, and stumbled toward the stage. She did not look like an elite society queen anymore. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup was smeared across her face, and she was weeping openly. She reached the bottom of the stairs and fell forward, grabbing my ankles with both hands. Her expensive manicured nails dug into the crimson fabric of my suit. She looked up at me with a face completely destroyed by fear and desperation. "Quinn, my beautiful daughter," she sobbed, her voice hoarse and desperate. "You have to save us. Harrison took everything. He took the house. He took the retirement fund. He ruined the charity. You have the power to fix this. You have the Obsidian Ventures money. Please, Quinn, you have to use the $647 million to save your family. I am your mother. You cannot let them take the house. Please, Quinn, I am begging you on my hands and knees. Do not let us lose everything. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life comparing me to my sister, telling me I was a disappointment, making me feel like I was entirely unworthy of love or respect. She was gripping my ankles, weeping like a child begging for salvation from the daughter she had always treated like garbage. She wanted me to use my hard-earned empire to rescue her from the consequences of her own blind vanity. I gently but firmly pulled my ankles out of her desperate grip. I took a step back and looked at the devastation surrounding me. Desmond and Victoria were being walked out of the ballroom in handcuffs, with camera flashes blinding them. Harrison was already in the back of a federal vehicle, his Ponzi scheme completely dismantled. Giselle was sitting on the floor weeping over her lost status, and my mother was sobbing uncontrollably at my feet, begging for a financial rescue that was never going to come. "You are going to need to find a very good bankruptcy lawyer, Mother," I said, my voice soft but completely devoid of mercy. "And Giselle, you should probably start looking for a small, affordable apartment. The penthouse belongs to me now, and I want you out by Monday." I turned my back on all of them and walked gracefully down the opposite side of the stage. The crimson-red suit moved flawlessly as I navigated the empty ballroom. Marcus met me at the side exit, opening the heavy wooden door to the private alleyway where my town car was waiting. I stepped out into the cool night air, the sound of my family weeping fading into the distance. The century's greatest payoff was finally complete, and I had never felt so incredibly free. The heavy wooden doors of the service exit slammed open behind me, shattering the quiet peace of the alleyway. I turned slowly as the harsh glare of the loading dock security lights flooded the damp pavement. Marcus had coordinated with the federal agents to use the private service corridor to extract their prisoners away from the chaotic main lobby, but the paparazzi had already caught wind of the raid. The flashing red and blue lights of the waiting federal vehicles painted the brick walls in a frantic, violent rhythm, and beyond the wrought iron security gates, a horde of reporters was already pressing against the barricades, their camera lenses completely focused on the absolute destruction of my family. Desmond and Victoria were dragged out first. Desmond was weeping openly, his bespoke suit ruined his knees, scraping against the concrete as he refused to walk. He was babbling incoherently to the stoic agents, begging them to call his lawyers, begging them to look at his fake financial projections. Victoria was no longer the serene corporate queen. She looked entirely unhinged. She was spitting vitriol at the agents, her silver gown torn at the hem, her makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She caught sight of me standing calmly by my town car and tried to lunge in my direction, but the agents simply tightened their grip and shoved her into the back of a waiting armored SUV. Then came Harrison. He was flanked by two massive federal agents. His head hung so low, his chin rested on his chest. He looked like a hollow shell of a man. The arrogant Wall Street swagger was completely erased, leaving nothing but a terrified criminal who knew he was going to spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary. Before the agents could load him into the vehicle, Giselle burst through the service doors like a woman possessed. She took one look at her husband being walked in handcuffs, and her entire reality simply snapped. The illusion of her perfect wealthy marriage, the country club memberships, the luxury penthouse, it was all evaporating right in front of her eyes. She let out a guttural, devastating scream and launched herself across the loading dock. She bypassed the security perimeter and slammed into Harrison, her small fists hammering against his chest and shoulders. "You lied to me, you absolute fraud!" Giselle shrieked, her voice echoing off the brick walls and completely audible to the hungry press gathered at the gates. "You told me you were a financial genius. You told me my friends were just jealous of our success. You printed fake spreadsheets on a home computer, you pathetic little man. You stole from my mother's charity to cover your own incompetence, and now I am going to lose everything." Harrison did not even try to defend himself. He just squeezed his eyes shut and let her hit him until two federal agents stepped in and forcefully pulled her back. Giselle fought against them, screaming that she was a victim, that she had absolutely no idea her husband was running a Ponzi scheme. She looked over at me, her beautiful face contorted with a frantic, desperate entitlement. "Quinn, you have to stop them!" she demanded, thrashing against the agents who were gently but firmly moving her away from the federal vehicles. Tell them you own the debt. Tell them you can pay it off. You have the $600 million. You cannot let them take my husband away. How am I supposed to maintain my lifestyle? How am I supposed to show my face at the country club? I looked at my sister, feeling a deep clinical detachment. She was not mourning the loss of the man she loved. She was mourning the loss of her credit cards. You should probably stop worrying about the country club, Giselle, I said, my voice carrying clearly over the chaotic noise of the alleyway. You do not have a membership anymore, and when the federal authorities seize your joint accounts tomorrow morning, you are not going to have a car to drive either. I suggest you call a taxi before the surge pricing hits. Giselle just stared at me, her mouth opening and closing in absolute horror as the agents finally pushed Harrison into the back of the cruiser and slammed the heavy door shut. But the true climax of the evening had not yet arrived. My mother stumbled out of the service doors, leaning heavily against the brick wall for support. Corinne looked as though she had aged 20 years in the span of 30 minutes. The majestic matriarch of the Oak Bluffs elite was entirely gone. Her elegant wrap dragged through a puddle on the concrete, and her expensive heels clicked erratically as she forced herself to walk toward my car. She saw the federal vehicles pulling away, carrying the men who had promised her generational wealth and absolute social dominance. She saw the flashing cameras of the paparazzi capturing the absolute downfall of the Addams family legacy. She reached me just as Jonathan stepped out of the back of my town car holding a thick leather briefcase. Corinne did not even notice him. She collapsed against the side of my car, her perfectly manicured hands sliding down the sleek black paint until she was practically on her knees. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and bloodshot, pleading with a desperation that was almost physically painful to witness. "Quinn," she gasped, her breath coming in ragged, panicked bursts. "The endowment, the charity fund, it is all gone. Harrison leveraged everything. My friends trusted me with their money. The entire community trusted me. I am ruined. They will take the estate. They will take everything I have ever built. You are the only one who can fix this. You own his debt now. You have the power to erase it. Please, Quinn, for the love of this family, for the legacy I sacrificed my entire life to build, you have to save us." She reached out and tried to grab my hands, but I smoothly stepped back, denying her the comfort of my touch. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire existence making me feel small, invisible, and completely inadequate. I thought about the endless dinners where she had praised Desmond and Victoria. I thought about the way she had dismissed my career as an administrative assistant and mocked my lack of ambition. "You want me to save the family legacy?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register that forced her to stop sobbing and listen. "What legacy exactly, Mother? The legacy of pretending to be wealthy while living on stolen money. The legacy of selling your own daughter to a narcissistic fraud just so you could brag about his fake initial public offering to your friends." Corinne shook her head violently, tears streaming down her ruined makeup. "No, Quinn, that is not true. I wanted what was best for all of us. I wanted us to be respected. I wanted us to be at the top." I knelt down so I was exactly at her eye level. I did not raise my voice, but every single word I spoke was a calculated strike designed to shatter the very foundation of her delusions. "You told me once that failures have no right to speak in this family," I said, echoing the exact cruel words she had used to silence me for years. "You told me to sign over my house to a man who was publicly humiliating me because you thought he was the winner and I was the loser. You looked the other way while Harrison ran a Ponzi scheme because he bought you expensive gifts and made you feel powerful. I did not destroy this family, Mother. Your greed did. Your absolute blind obsession with status burned this family to the ground, and I simply stood back and let you hand Harrison the matches." Corinne let out a wounded, broken wail and buried her face in her hands. She knew every single word was the absolute, undeniable truth. She had traded her integrity for the illusion of elite status, and now she was entirely bankrupt in every possible sense of the word. I stood back up and extended my hand toward Jonathan. He opened his leather briefcase and handed me a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy, formal paper. I looked down at my mother, who was still trembling on the wet concrete of the loading dock. I was not going to give her a free pass, but I was going to offer her exactly one path to survival, and it required her to completely dismantle her own ego. I dropped the heavy stack of documents directly at her feet. They hit the damp pavement with a sharp, decisive smack. I am not going to erase Harrison's debt, I said, my voice echoing with finality, but I am going to offer you an ultimatum. In those documents is a formal cooperation agreement with the federal prosecutors and a complete transfer of the Oak Bluffs Charity Board records. You have exactly 24 hours to walk into the federal courthouse and officially testify against your golden son-in-law. I want you to detail every single offshore wire you helped him authorize. I want you to hand over the minutes of every board meeting where you pressured your friends to invest in his fraudulent fund. I want you to publicly admit to the entire world exactly what you facilitated. Corinne looked up at the documents and then back at me, her eyes filled with absolute terror. If I do that, I will be a total pariah, she whispered, her voice cracking with horror. My friends will never speak to me again. I will be banished from the society I built. I will lose all my respect. I stared at her, feeling the last lingering thread of sympathy completely sever. Your respect is already gone, Mother, I stated coldly. The only thing you have left to lose is your freedom. If you sign those papers and cooperate fully with the federal investigation, I will use my holding company to anonymously cover the specific losses of the charity fund so your friends do not lose their retirement money. But you will step down in absolute disgrace. And if I do not? She asked, her hands shaking as she hovered over the documents. I smiled a completely ruthless and terrifying smile. If you do not sign them, then tomorrow morning, Obsidian Ventures will officially foreclose on your suburban estate. I will seize the cars, the bank accounts, and every single piece of jewelry you bought with Harrison's dirty money. You will drown in millions of dollars of toxic debt completely on your own, and you will likely end up in a federal cell right next to him. I did not wait for her to make her decision. I knew exactly what she would do. Corinne was a survivor above all else, and she would throw Harrison under the bus the exact second she realized it was her only way to stay out of prison. I turned away from the sobbing wreckage of my family and slid into the plush leather interior of the town car. Jonathan closed the door behind me, sealing out the noise of the sirens, the crying, and the frantic shouts of the paparazzi. The engine purred to life, and the car smoothly pulled out of the alleyway, merging into the bright, chaotic traffic of the city. I leaned back into the soft leather and watched the flashing lights of the Ritz-Carlton fade into the distance behind me. The empire they had tried to build on my back was completely destroyed, and I was the one holding all the ashes. The war was officially over. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the car's console and took a long, quiet sip, finally enjoying the absolute silence of my victory. 7 months passed since that night at the Ritz-Carlton. The absolute silence of my victory in the back of the town car eventually gave way to the cold, mechanical reality of the legal system. I sat at a heavy mahogany table in the Federal Family Courthouse of downtown Atlanta. The room was lined with dark wood paneling and smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. I wore a tailored charcoal suit projecting the image of a calm, rational professional. Desmond sat at the table opposite mine, and he looked like a completely different person. The bespoke suits and arrogant billionaire posture were completely gone. He was wearing an ill-fitting gray jacket that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. His hair was thinning, and his face was pale and slick with nervous sweat. He had burned through his expensive defense attorneys months ago. He was now represented by a desperate, sleazy lawyer working on a contingency fee, hoping to extract a miracle from the wreckage of Desmond's life. The divorce proceedings were reaching their final hour, and Desmond's lawyer decided to throw a desperate Hail Mary. He stood up, adjusting his cheap tie, and addressed the judge. He claimed that because Obsidian Ventures was established during our marriage, Desmond was legally entitled to exactly 50% of my holding company. He argued that Desmond had been a supportive husband who provided the stable environment necessary for my financial success. He actually had the sheer audacity to claim that my $74 million empire was built on the foundation of Desmond's hard work. Desmond sat beside him, nodding frantically, his eyes darting toward the judge with a pathetic, desperate hope. He thought he could steal half of my kingdom to pay for his mounting criminal defense fees. I did not flinch or react to the absurd claim. I simply looked at my lead attorney, Evelyn. Evelyn was a ruthless legal predator who operated with terrifying efficiency. She stood up slowly, smoothing the front of her blazer. She did not raise her voice or engage in theatrical arguments. She simply picked up a thick blue folder and approached the judge's bench. She announced that she was submitting Exhibit A into the formal record. It was the ironclad prenuptial agreement that Desmond himself had aggressively forced me to sign 6 years ago. Desmond had hired a team of expensive lawyers to draft that document because he wanted to ensure I could never touch a single penny of his imaginary Apex Tech wealth. He had demanded a specific clause stating that any business venture created independently by either spouse would remain their sole and separate property. Desmond had been so blinded by his own greed that he had legally locked himself out of my empire long before it even existed. Desmond's jaw dropped open as he realized what his own legal document meant. He slumped back in his chair, the desperate hope completely draining from his eyes. But Evelyn was not finished. She was not there to just defend my assets. She was there to absolutely annihilate him. She opened a second massive folder and began laying out the indisputable banking records we had compiled. She presented undeniable mathematical proof that Desmond had drained our joint marital accounts to fund his corporate embezzlement and his affair. She showed the judge the exact wire transfers Desmond used to purchase Victoria's 5-carat diamond ring. She produced the receipts for the luxury hotel suites and the expensive vacations they took while I was working. She proved that he had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars of marital funds to prop up his fake initial public offering. Desmond stood up from his chair, his face turning a dark, violent shade of red. He started shouting at the judge, claiming the bank records were fabricated and that I had set him up to ruin his life. He screamed that I was a vindictive liar. The judge demanded order, threatening to hold Desmond in contempt of court, but the true final blow was just arriving. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. 2 armed federal marshals walked into the room, escorting Victoria Vance. She was no longer wearing her ridiculous silver designer gowns or flashing her stolen diamonds. She was wearing a standard-issue bright orange prison jumpsuit. Her blonde hair was flat and unwashed, and she looked exhausted and completely broken. She had been brought from the federal detention center as a subpoenaed witness regarding the dissipation of our marital assets. Desmond looked at her with a sudden, pathetic glimmer of relief. He actually thought she was going to defend him. He thought they were still a team united against me. But Victoria walked straight to the witness stand without even making eye contact with him. She sat down and swore to tell the truth. Evelyn approached the stand and asked Victoria to clarify the source of the funds used to sustain her lifestyle over the past year. Victoria leaned into the microphone and completely turned on Desmond. She had accepted a plea deal with federal prosecutors to get a lighter sentence in her upcoming federal trial, and part of that deal required absolute cooperation. She told the judge exactly how Desmond orchestrated the entire corporate fraud. She confirmed that he stole money from my personal savings to buy her affection because his own accounts were overdrawn. She told the court that Desmond used to laugh about draining my bank accounts because he genuinely believed I was too uneducated and socially incompetent to ever notice the missing money. She threw him under the bus with a cold, clinical precision that left the entire courtroom in absolute silence. Desmond collapsed back into his chair as if he had been physically shot. He put his head down on the mahogany table and began to sob loudly. It was a pathetic, ugly, wet sound that echoed through the quiet room. He cried for his lost wealth, his lost status, and the absolute humiliation of being destroyed by the 2 women he thought he could control. The judge looked down from the bench with an expression of pure, absolute disgust. He did not need to deliberate or review the evidence any further. He stated clearly for the record that Desmond's actions constituted severe financial abuse, egregious marital fraud, and a complete violation of trust. He denied Desmond's claim to Obsidian Ventures completely. The judge picked up his wooden gavel and banged it down with a sharp crack that signaled the absolute end of Desmond's life. He awarded me 100% of all remaining marital assets. He then stripped Desmond of everything and slapped him with massive civil damages for the stolen funds and the emotional distress he had inflicted. The ruling ensured that if Desmond ever managed to make a single penny for the rest of his miserable life, it would be immediately seized and transferred directly to my accounts. The court was dismissed. I stood up, buttoned my charcoal blazer, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. I stepped through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse and out into the warm, bright Atlanta afternoon. The air felt clean and entirely full of promise. A few minutes later, I watched from the top of the marble steps as Desmond was escorted out of the building by the bailiffs. He walked out into the harsh sunlight, a completely broken man. He had no house to return to because I owned it. He had no cars, no bank accounts, no venture capital friends, and no family willing to take his calls. He was entirely penniless and completely homeless. He slowly walked down the concrete steps of the courthouse, dragging his feet as he descended into the crowded city streets, staring down the barrel of a massive federal criminal trial that was guaranteed to lock him in a cage for decades. I watched him disappear into the sea of ordinary people, finally erased from my world forever. The dust settled over the city of Atlanta like the quiet aftermath of a massive, devastating seismic event. It took less than 8 months for the entire illusion of my family's legacy to be completely and permanently erased from the earth. I did not just ruin them financially, I dismantled the very psychological foundation they had used to torture me my entire life. Harrison was swiftly sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, money laundering, and operating a massive Ponzi scheme. His arrogant Wall Street smirk was permanently replaced by the bleak, terrifying reality of a cinderblock cell and a strict daily routine dictated by armed guards. He tried to reach out to me once through his public defender, asking for a leniency statement, but my legal team ensured the letter was returned to sender without ever crossing my desk. Giselle did not fare much better than the man she had so proudly paraded around the country club. The woman who used to mock my lack of designer clothes and brag about her elite social status was now working the cosmetics counter at a mid-tier department store just to afford her basic groceries. All of her joint accounts with Harrison had been immediately frozen and seized by the federal government, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the few suitcases of clothes she managed to pack before I evicted her from the penthouse. I visited that specific mall once on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, just to observe her from a distance. I stood near a display of luxury handbags and watched my sister spray cheap perfume samples onto the wrists of passing tourists. She was wearing a rigid, uncomfortable polyester uniform and forcing a painfully fake smile that did not reach her exhausted, hollow eyes. Her hands were visibly shaking as she tried to convince a customer to buy a discounted lotion set. The absolute defeat in her posture was a masterpiece of poetic justice. She had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to reach the top, and now she was suffocating at the very bottom, terrified that her old society friends might walk past the counter and see exactly what she had become. My mother, Corinne, suffered the most spectacular and public descent of them all. She had chosen to sign the federal cooperation agreement to save herself from joining Harrison in prison, but the social fallout was absolute and totally unforgiving. The elite society friends she had spent decades cultivating turned their backs on her the exact second the federal indictments were unsealed, and the news hit the local papers. When she tried to attend her usual charity luncheons, she was politely but firmly asked to leave by the security staff. Her sprawling suburban estate, the physical monument to her massive ego and lifelong vanity, had been legally foreclosed on by Obsidian Ventures. I sold it to a commercial real estate developer who immediately bulldozed the entire property to the ground to build a dense luxury condominium complex. Corinne was now living in a cramped, dark, one-bedroom apartment on the grimy outskirts of the city. She spent her days sitting in a worn armchair, listening to the loud arguments of her neighbors through paper-thin walls, surrounded by cardboard boxes containing the few cheap possessions she was allowed to keep. She tried to call me a dozen times a week, leaving long, weeping voicemails begging for forgiveness. She apologized for calling me a failure. She apologized for forcing me to endure Desmond's abuse. She constantly asked for a small monthly allowance, just a tiny fraction of my wealth, to help her move to a better neighborhood. I never returned a single call. I never sent a single dime. She had gladly traded my mental health and my future for her fake social status, and now she was paying the ultimate absolute price of total isolation. She was left alone with nothing but the haunting memory of the empire she had helped destroy. While my family crumbled into absolute obscurity, my own empire was expanding with a terrifying, undeniable speed. I did not just liquidate Apex Tech after taking over the controlling shares. I stripped the entire corporation down to its very foundation, firing every single corrupt executive, arrogant tech bro, and useless board member Desmond had hired to prop up his massive delusions. The corporate headquarters was completely purged of the toxic frat house culture that Desmond and Victoria had carefully cultivated. I took the ashes of their fake empire and I rebuilt it into something entirely real and completely undeniable. I personally restructured the entire executive board and the upper management teams. I did not hire based on elite country club connections or fake venture capital pedigrees. I appointed highly qualified, incredibly brilliant, and deeply deserving Black women to every single major leadership role in the company. Women who had been constantly overlooked in the industry, women who had been told they were not the right fit, women who had been forced to train the arrogant, mediocre men who were promoted above them. I gave them the absolute power, the massive capital, and the creative freedom to actually change the tech landscape. We completely discarded Desmond's vaporware and focused on developing actual sustainable software solutions. Within 6 months, Apex Tech was completely rebranded as Apex Innovations, and it was operating with absolute crushing efficiency. We were no longer a fake startup built on stolen money and media spin. We were a massive, legitimate tech titan quietly acquiring competitors and dominating the market sector with terrifying precision. My base of operations was no longer a quiet home office with multiple monitors hidden away in the suburbs. It was the entire top floor of a gleaming glass skyscraper in the absolute center of Manhattan. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, looking out over the sprawling electric grid of the city. The sun was slowly sinking below the horizon, casting a brilliant deep crimson glow across the skyline that perfectly matched the color of the suit I had worn to completely destroy Desmond. The office was vast and quiet, the only sound being the soft humming of the city traffic far below me. The interior was decorated in sleek dark tones and polished obsidian surfaces, a physical manifestation of my absolute control. I held a heavy crystal glass of incredibly rare vintage red wine, taking a slow, deliberate sip, as I looked down at the empire I had built entirely on my own terms. My phone buzzed softly on the polished surface of my massive mahogany desk. I walked over and picked it up, staring down at the glowing screen. It was an incoming text message from an unsaved number, but I recognized the frantic, pathetic tone immediately. It was Desmond. He was currently awaiting his federal criminal trial, living in a cheap weekly motel, and completely drowning in the massive civil damages the family court judge had awarded me. He was facing decades in prison, and his entire legal defense had completely collapsed when Victoria officially testified against him. The text was a long, rambling paragraph of pure, unadulterated desperation. He begged me to remember the early years of our relationship, before the money and the greed ruined everything. He pleaded for a tiny personal loan, just enough to help him hire a decent lawyer, because his public defender was completely ignoring his calls. He told me he was starving, that he was terrified of going to prison, and that he knew I still had a good heart buried somewhere under all my anger. He actually thought he could still manipulate my empathy. He truly believed that the quiet, supportive wife he had emotionally tortured for 6 years was still alive somewhere inside of me. waiting to rescue him from the consequences of his own monstrous ego. He promised he would pay me back every single cent if I just gave him one more chance to prove he could be a good man. I looked at the pathetic, desperate message glowing on the screen, and I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, refreshing wave of total, absolute peace. I did not feel the need to respond to mock him or to tell him exactly how much I was enjoying his complete destruction. I did not need to remind him that he had spit on my loyalty and tried to leave me with absolutely nothing. True, absolute power does not need to explain itself to a dying parasite. I simply tapped the screen, selecting the option to delete the message completely and permanently block the number. I tossed the phone back onto the smooth mahogany desk and picked up my crystal glass of wine, turning my attention back to the glowing, beautiful city skyline. I was no longer the scapegoat daughter forced to swallow insults to keep the peace. I was no longer the invisible administrative assistant working in the shadows. I was no longer the discarded wife deemed socially unfit for a world of fake elites. I was the absolute, undisputed architect of my own destiny. I had walked straight through the burning fire of their betrayal, and I had not just survived it. I had bought the entire inferno and used it to forge a permanent, unbreakable kingdom. The night was quiet, my empire was entirely secure, and for the first time in my entire life, absolute freedom was finally mine. The story of Quinn teaches us a powerful truth. True strength does not need to shout. It operates in calculated silence. When faced with toxic family dynamics and profound betrayal, the ultimate revenge is never a screaming match. It is building your own undeniable success. Blood does not automatically guarantee loyalty, and you are under no obligation to sacrifice your well-being to protect those who continually tear you down. Genuine independence requires walking away from the false narratives others project onto you to claim your own worth. Ultimately, profound healing begins the moment you stop seeking validation from those committed to misunderstanding you and instead invest that energy into forging your own unbreakable empire. If you have ever had to boldly cut toxic ties to protect your peace, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories of triumphant comebacks, and let me know in the comments how you built your own empire.